I want to do a short reading from a book by T.H. White, which I was given years ago when I was a small boy, and I was visiting a neighbouring farm, and the lady on the farm, whose name was Eileen, gave me her copy of The Sword in the Stone, which I've treasured ever since, and a copy of a book called The Robe, which I still have, and a copy of a wonderful book about the theatre, which I'm afraid I've lost, and I most regret losing that. But in this little episode, I want to read, which I've given out as a comprehension piece. So I thought this might be a useful way of guiding people to the text. In this episode from T.H. White's The Sword in the Stone, the Wart, the young Arthur, encounters Merlin the Wizard for the first time after becoming lost while trying to return to Sir Ector's castle. Merlin already knows the boy's name because, unlike ordinary people, he experiences time backwards, and White presents him as a wonderfully comic mixture of traditional magician and eccentric modern scholar, a sort of character who's somehow wandered out of Hogwarts back into the 1930s. He wears the expected pointed hat and a gown covered with signs from the zodiac and magic symbols, the arcana, the esoterica, and horned-rimmed spectacles. He smokes a pipe, and he possesses objects from centuries in the future. His cottage is similarly anarchic, filled with books, animals, scientific instruments, fishing equipment, modern objects, and magical creatures. The talking owl, Archimedes, immediately distrusts the Wart, but gradually accepts him after being offered a mouse. Breakfast provides another demonstration of Merlin's magic with an animated mustard pot and later crockery which washes itself. Merlin then explains his peculiar relationship with time through the analogy of trying to draw while looking in a mirror, and he knows Arthur's future because, from Merlin's perspective, much of Arthur's future has already happened. The episode ends with Merlin announcing that he is returning to Sir Ector's castle to become the Wart's tutor. Arthur suddenly understands his accidental adventure as a genuine quest. White published The Sword in the Stone in 1938, drawing upon the much older Arthurian tradition, especially Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, and White radically reworks the material by concentrating on Arthur's childhood and education rather than beginning with the heroic king. His spelling of Merlin distinguishes the character from the more conventional Merlin, and the Disney 1963 animated adaptation changes the spelling back to what we would expect, Merlin, and simplifies the character and his costume considerably. Disney's Merlin retains the long beard, the blue robe, the pointed hat, the spectacles, the absent-mindedness, and the knowledge of the future. So the essential comic idea comes directly from T.H. White. Yet White's Merlin is stranger, dirtier, more intellectual, more eccentric. His gown is crowded with occult imagery. Birds have apparently nested in his hair, and he is covered with bird droppings. He is also more melancholy. Living backwards is not merely a comic supernatural ability. Merlin knows what will happen to people, but struggles with whether events might be prevented given his relationship with Arthur. There's that underlying sadness because he knows how the story of Camelot will end. Disney turns Merlin more firmly into an affectionate, irascible comic wizard and teacher. White's Merlin, however, is simultaneously magician, philosopher, naturalist, eccentric schoolmaster, which of course T.H. White had been in Stowe School, and anachronism. Disney preserves much of the humour, but White gives the character considerably more intellectual and emotional depth. So I've produced a few pictures. So here is the meeting with Merlin and Arthur. Though I think probably we would begin here with the Wart waking up after having spent the night asleep in the forest having first met King Pellinore, who becomes Sir Pellinore in the Disney film, and Pellinore is looking for the questing beast that he's lost. And so in the book, Arthur meets two rather crazy old men. In the film, Pellinore is a character who's introduced a little later in Sir Ector's court. Let's have a look at it and see what we can make of the text. So, this is from chapter 3. The old gentleman that Wart saw was a singular spectacle. He was dressed in a flowing gown with fur tippets, which had the signs of the zodiac embroidered all over it, together with various cabalistic signs, as of triangles with eyes on them, queer crosses, leaves of trees, bones and birds and animals, and a planetarium whose stars shone like bits of looking-glass with the sun on them. He had a pointed hat like a dunce's cap, or like the headgear worn by ladies of that time, except that the ladies were accustomed to have a bit of veil floating from the top of it. He also had a wand of lignum vitae, which he laid down in the grass beside him, and a pair of horn-rimmed spectacles like those of King Pellinore. They were extraordinary spectacles, being without earpieces, but shaped rather like scissors, or like the antenna of the tarantula wasp. "Excuse me, sir," said the wart, "but can you tell me the way to Sir Ector's castle, if you don't mind?" The aged gentleman put down his bucket and looked at the wart. "Your name would be Wart," he said. "Yes, sir. Please, sir," said the wart. "My name," said the aged gentleman, "is Merlin." "How do you do?" said the wart. "How do you do?" said Merlin. "It is clement weather, is it not?" "It is," said the wart, "for the time of year." When these formalities had been concluded, the wart had leisure to examine his new acquaintance more closely. The aged gentleman was staring at him with a kind of unwinking and benevolent curiosity, which made him feel that it would not be at all rude to stare back, no ruder than it would be to stare at one of the guardian's crows for happening to be ruminating his personality as she leant her head over a gate. Merlin had a long white beard and long white moustache which hung down on either side of it, and close inspection showed that it was far from clean. It was not that he had dirty fingernails or anything like that, but some large bird seemed to be nesting in his hair. The wart was familiar with the nests of sparhawk and goss, those crazy conglomerations of sticks and oddments which had been taken over from squirrels and crows, and he knew how the twigs and the tree foot were splashed with white mutes, old bones, muddy feathers, and castings. This was the impression which he gathered from Merlin. The old gentleman was streaked with droppings over his shoulders among the stars and the triangles of his gown, and a large spider was slowly lowering itself from the tip of his hat as he gazed and slowly blinked at the little boy in front of him. He had a faintly worried expression, as though he were trying to remember some name which began with Joy, but which was pronounced in quite a different way. Maybe Menges, or was it... What was it? His mild blue eyes, very big and round under the tarantula spectacles, gradually filmed and clouded over as he gazed at the boy, and then he turned his head away with a resigned expression, as though it was all too much for him after all. "Do you like peaches?" asked the old gentleman. "Very much indeed," answered the wart, and his mouth began to water, so that it was full of sweet, soft liquid. "It is only July, you know," said the old man reprovingly, and walked off in the direction of the cottage without looking round. The wart followed him, since this was the simplest thing to do, and offered to carry the bucket, which seemed to please the old gentleman who gave it to him, and waited while he counted the keys and muttered and mislaid them and dropped them on the grass, and finally, when they had got their way into the black and white cottage with as much trouble as if they were burglaring it, he climbed up the ladder after his host and found himself in the upstairs room. It was the most marvellous room that Wart had ever been in. There was a cockindrill hanging from the rafters. Let me see if I can find that. There we are. There was a cockindrill hanging from the rafters, very lifelike and horrible, with glass eyes and scaly tail stretched out behind it. When its master came into the room, it winked one eye in salutation, although it was stuffed. There were hundreds of thousands of brown books in leather bindings, some chained to the bookshelves and others propped up against each other, as if they had been too much spirits to drink and didn't really trust themselves. These gave out a smell of must and solid brownness, which was most secure. And then there were stuffed birds, popinjays, maggot pies, and kingfishers, and peacocks with all their feathers but two, and tiny birds like beetles, and a reputed phoenix which smelt of incense and cinnamon. It couldn't have been a real phoenix, because there is only one of those at any one time. Over the mantelpiece there was a fox's mask with Grafton, Buckingham to Daventry, 2 hours 20 minutes written under it, and also a £40 salmon with Orr, 43 minutes, Bulldog written under it, and a very lifelike basilisk with Crowhorse otter hounds in Roman print. There were several boars' tusks and a claw and the claws of tigers and libards mounted in symmetrical patterns, and a big head of Ovis poli, 6 live grass snakes in a kind of aquarium, some nests of the solitary wasp, nicely set up in a glass cylinder, and an ordinary beehive whose inhabitants went in and out of the window unmolested, 2 young hedgehogs in cotton wool, a pair of badgers which immediately began to cry yick, 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 yick in loud voices as soon as the magician appeared, 20 boxes which contained stick caterpillars and cysts of the pus moth, and even an oleander that was worth 2 and 6, all feeding on the appropriate leaves, a gun case with all sorts of weapons which would not be invented for 500 years, a rod box ditto, a lovely chest of drawers full of salmon flies which had been tied by Merlin himself, another chest whose drawers were labelled Mandragoria, Mandrake, Old Man's Beard, etc., a bunch of turkey feathers and goose quills for making pens, an astrolabe, 12 pairs of boots, a dozen purse nets, 3 dozen rabbit wires, 12 corkscrews, an ant's nest between 2 glass plates, ink bottles of every possible colour, from red to violet, darning needles, a gold medal for being the best scholar at Eton, 4 or 5 recorders, a nest of field mice, all alive, 2 skulls, plenty of cut glass, Venetian glass, Bristol glass, and a bottle of mastic varnish, some Satsuma china, some Clisson, the 14th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, marred as it was by the sensationalism of the popular plates, 2 paint boxes, 1 oil, 1 watercolour, 3 globes of the known geographical world, a few fossils, the stuffed head of a camel leopard, 6 pismires, some glass retorts with cauldrons, Bunsen burners, etc., and the complete set of cigarette cards depicting wildfowl by Peter Scott. Merlin took off his pointed hat, and when he came into this extraordinary chamber, because it was too high for the roof, and immediately there was a little scamper in one of the dark corners, and a flap of soft wings, and a young tawny owl was sitting on the black skull cap which protected the top of his head. "Oh, what a lovely owl!" cried the wart. But when he went up to it and held out his hand, the owl grew half as tall again, stood up stiff as a poker, closed its eyes so that there was only the smallest slit to peep through, as one is in the habit of doing when told to shut one's eyes at hide and seek, and said in a doubtful voice, "There is no owl." Then it shut its eyes entirely and looked the other way. "It's only a boy," said Merlin. "There is no boy," said the owl hopefully, without turning round. The wart was so startled by finding that the owl could talk that he forgot his manners and came closer still. At this the owl became so nervous that it made a mess on Merlin's head. The whole room was quite white with droppings, and flew off to perch on the furthest tip of the cockindrill's tail, out of reach. We see so little company," explained Merlin, wiping his head with half a worn-out pair of pyjama tops, which he kept for that purpose, that Archimedes is a little shy of strangers. "Come, Archimedes, I want you to meet a friend of mine called Wart." Here he held out his hand to the owl, who came waddling like a goose along the Corkindrill's back. He waddled with this rolling gait so as to keep his tail from being damaged, and hopped down onto Merlin's finger with every sign of reluctance. "Hold out your finger," said Merlin, "and put it behind your legs. No, lift it up under his train." And when the Wart had done this, Merlin moved the owl gently backwards so that the Wart's finger pressed against its legs from behind, and it either had to step back onto the finger or get pushed off its balance altogether. It stepped back, and the Wart stood there delighted, while the furry little feet held tight onto his finger and the sharp claws pricked his skin. "Now, say, how do you do properly?" said Merlin. "I won't," said Archimedes, looking the other way and holding very tight. "Oh, he is lovely," said the Wart again. "How long have you had him?" "Archimedes has stayed with me since he was quite small, indeed, since he had a tiny head like a chicken's." "I wish he would talk to me," said the Wart. "Perhaps if you were to give him this mouse here politely, he might learn to know you better." Merlin took the dead mouse out of his skull-cap. "I always keep him there," he said, "and worms too, for fishing. I find it most convenient." And he handed it to the Wart, who held it out rather gingerly towards Archimedes. The nutty little curved beak looked as if it were capable of doing damage, but Archimedes looked closely at the mouse, blinked at the Wart, moved nearer on the finger, closed his eyes, and leant forward. He stood there with closed eyes and an expression of rapture on his face, as if he were saying grace, and then, with the absurdest little sideways nibble, took the morsel so gently that he would not have broken a soap bubble. He remained leaning forward with closed eyes, with the mouse suspended from his beak, as if he were not sure what he was going to do with it. Then he lifted his right foot, he was right-handed, and took hold of the mouse. He held it up like a boy holding a stick of rock, or a constable with his truncheon, looked at it, nibbled its tail. He turned it round so that it was head first, for the Wart had offered it the wrong way round, and gave one gulp. He looked round at the company with the tail hanging out of the corner of his mouth, as if to say, "I wish you wouldn't all stare at me so," turned his head away, politely swallowed the tail, scratched his sailor's beard with his left toe, and began to ruffle out his feathers. "Leave him alone," said Merlin. "Now, for perhaps he doesn't want to be friends with you until he knows what you are like. With owls it's never easy come, easy go." "Perhaps he will sit on my shoulder," said the Wart, and with that he instinctively lowered his hand so that the owl, who liked to be as high as possible, ran up the slope and stood shyly beside his ear. "Now, breakfast," said Merlin. The Wart saw that the most perfect breakfast was laid out neatly for two on the table before the window. There were peaches, there were also melons, strawberries and cream, rusks, brown trout piping hot, grilled perch, which was much nicer, chicken devilled enough to burn one's mouth out, kidneys and mushrooms on toast, fricassee, curry, and a choice of boiling coffee, or best chocolate made with cream in large cups. "Have some mustard," said Merlin. When they'd got to the kidneys, the mustard pot got up and walked over to his plate on thin silver legs that waddled like the owl's. Then it uncurled its handles, and one handle lifted its lid with exaggerated courtesy, while the other helped him to a generous spoonful. "Oh, I love the mustard pot," said Wart. "Wherever did you get it?" At this the pot beamed all over its face and began to strut a bit, but Merlin rapped it on the head with a teaspoon so that it sat down and shut up at once. "It's not a bad pot," he said grudgingly, "only it is inclined to give itself airs." The wart was so impressed by the kindness of the old magician, and particularly by all the lovely things which he possessed, that he hardly liked to ask him personal questions. It seemed politer to sit still and speak when he was spoken to, but Merlin didn't speak very much, and when he did speak it was never in questions, so that the wart had little opportunity for conversation. At last his curiosity got the better of him, and he asked something which had been puzzling him for some time. "Would you mind if I asked a question?" "It is what I am here for," said Merlin sadly. "How did you know to set the breakfast for 2? The old gentleman leaned back in his chair and lit an enormous meerschaum pipe. Good gracious! He breathes fire, thought the wart, who had never heard of tobacco, before he was ready to reply. And then he looked puzzled, took off his skull cap, 3 mice fell out, and scratched in the middle of his bald head. "Have you ever tried to draw in a looking-glass?" asked Merlin. "I don't think I have," said the wart. "Looking-glass," said the old gentleman, holding out his hand, and immediately there was a tiny lady's vanity-glass in his hand. "Not that kind, you fool," said Merlin angrily. "I want one big enough to shave in." The vanity-glass vanished, and in its place there was a shaving mirror about a foot square. Merlin then demanded pencil and paper in quick succession, got an unsharpened pencil from the Morning Post, sent that back, got a fountain pen with no ink in it, and 6 reams of brown paper suitable for parcels, and sent them back too, flew into a passion in which he said "Byre, lady" quite often, and ended up with a carbon pencil, some cigarette papers, which he said would have to do. He put one of the papers in front of the glass and made 5 dots on it. Bum, 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 bum. Like that. "And now," he said, "I want you to join those 5 dots up to make a W, looking in the glass." The wart took the pen and tried to do as he was bid, but after a lot of false starts, the letter which he produced looked like this. "Well, it isn't bad," said Merlin doubtfully, "and in a way it does look a bit like an M." And then he fell into a reverie, stroking his beard, breathing fire, and staring at the paper. "About the breakfast?" asked the wart timidly, after he'd waited 5 minutes. "Ah, yes. How did you know to set breakfast? How did I know to set breakfast for 2? That was why I showed you the looking-glass. Now, ordinary people are born forwards in time. If you understand what I mean, and nearly everything in the world goes forward too. That makes it quite easy for ordinary people to live, just as it would be easy to join those 5 dots into a W if we're allowed to look at them forwards instead of backwards and inside out. But I, unfortunately, was born at the wrong end of time, and I have to live backwards from in front, while surrounded by a lot of people living forwards from behind. Some people call it having second sight." Merlin stopped talking and looked at the wart in an anxious way. "Have I told you this before?" "No," said the wart. "We only met half an hour ago." "So little time to pass as that," said Merlin, with a big tear that ran down the end of his nose. He wiped it off with his pyjama tops and added anxiously, "Am I going to tell it to you again?" "I don't know," said the wart, "unless you haven't finished telling it to me yet." "You see," said Merlin, "one gets confused with time when it is like that. All one's tenses get muddled up, for one thing. If you know what's going to happen to people and not what has happened to them, it makes it so difficult to prevent it happening. If you don't want it to have happened, if you see what I mean, like drawing in a mirror." The wart didn't quite see, but was just going to say that he was sorry for Merlin if those things made him unhappy, when he felt an unconscious sensation at his ear. "Don't jump," said Merlin, just as he was going to do so, and the wart sat still. Archimedes, who had been standing forgotten on his shoulder all this time, was gently touching himself against him. The beak was right against the lobe of his ear, with its bristles beginning to tickle, and suddenly a soft, hoarse little voice whispered, "How do you do?" so that it sounded right inside his head. "Oh, Owl!" cried the wart, forgetting about Merlin's troubles instantly. "Look, he's decided to talk to me." The wart gently leant his head against the soft feathers, and the brown owl, taking the rim of his ear in his beak, quickly nibbled right around it with the smallest nibbles. I should call him Archie, exclaimed the wart. I trust you will do nothing of the sort, cried Merlin instantly in a stern and angry voice, and the owl withdrew to the furthest corner of his shoulder. Is it wrong? You might as well call me Wall or Oily, said the owl sourly, and be done with it. Or Bubbles, added the owl in a bitter voice. Merlin took the wart's hand and said kindly, You're only young and do not understand these things, but you will learn that owls are the politest and most courteous, single-hearted and faithful creatures living, and you must never be rude or familiar or vulgar with them and make them look ridiculous. Their mother is Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and though they are often ready to play the buffoon for your amusement, such conduct is the prerogative of the truly wise. No owl can possibly be called Archie. I am sorry, Owl, said the wart. And I am sorry, boy, said the owl. I can see that you spoke in ignorance, and I bitterly regret that I should have been so petty as to take offence where none was intended. The owl really did regret it, and looked so remorseful and upset that Merlin had to put on a very cheerful manner and change the conversation. Well, now that we've finished breakfast, I think it's high time that we should all three find our way back to Sir Ector. Excuse me for a moment, he added as an afterthought, and turned round to the breakfast things. He pointed a knobbly finger at them and said in a stern voice, Wash up. Or at this, all the china. At this, all the china. And cutlery scrambled down off the table, the cloth emptied the crumbs out of the window, and the napkins folded themselves up. All ran off down the ladder to where Merlin had left the bucket, and there was such a noise and yelling as if a lot of children had been let out of school. Merlin went to the door and shouted, Mind nobody is to get broken! But his voice was entirely drowned in shrill squeals, splashes, and cries of, My, it's cold, I shan't stay in long. Look out, you'll break me, and come on, let's duck the teapot. Are you really coming all the way home with me? Asked the wart, who could hardly believe the good news. Why not? Said Merlin. How else shall I be your tutor? At this, the wart's eyes grew rounder and rounder until they were about as big as the owl's, who was sitting on his shoulder, and his face got redder and redder, and a big breath seemed to gather itself beneath his heart. My, exclaimed the wart, while his eyes sparkled with excitement at the discovery, I must have been on a quest.